Hello and welcome to another 12-Minute Mark. Have you ever walked into someone's garage or maybe a store and you see an item that's there and you have no idea what it is, and you go to ask the person maybe that's working there or it's their place, and they start off by saying, well, I'll tell you what it's not. And the reason they might tell you what it's not is because many people over and over have come in there and they've seen that item and they say, I know what that is, and they're wrong. And so this person has now gathered this long story of wrong theories about what this thing happens to be. Well, this happens to us here in Mark chapter 13, the Olivet Discourse. It is the longest piece of Jesus' teaching, his longest consecutive monologue of teaching, and it is the most convoluted and can be a little confusing. And it's some end time stuff and some other warnings. And back then, at those times, the theories of the end of the world abound, and everyone had their own theory. And there's still a lot of this going around where everyone, something happens and someone might say, oh, well, this is the end, or this is the sign of the end, and that's what Jesus was dealing with. So he's just been teaching in the temple, it's Holy Week, and then they go outside. So chapter 13 starts, as he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what magnificent stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see these great buildings? Said Jesus. Not one stone will be left upon another. They'll all be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting there across the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they will be fulfilled? Jesus said, well, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come claiming, saying, I am he, and they will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be afraid. Such things must happen, but the kingdom is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are just the beginning of birth pains. You have to be on your guard, though. You'll be handed over to the local councils and flogged in synagogues, and on account of me you will stand before governors and kings, and you'll have to be witnesses. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. Whenever you're arrested and brought in, don't worry beforehand about what you will say. Just say whatever is given you at the time, for it will be the Spirit speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his son. Children will rebel against parents and have them put to death, and all men will hate you because of me. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation, let the reader understand. Where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on their roof go down to get anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back for their coat. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray this won't take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, whom he has chosen, he shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here he is, or look, there's the Christ, do not believe it, for false Christs and prophets will appear before signs and wonders that would deceive even the elect if that were possible. So be on your guard. I've told you everything ahead of time. Well, there's the first half of the discourse, chapter 13. And again, there's many theories and a lot of end-time types of things going on, but really Mark has spoken things thematically more than chronologically, and we've seen that, where he'll have The last several chapters were about the cost of the discipleship, and before that it was about radical faith, and before that it was his identity and his authority. And here we're still talking about the cost of discipleship, because while there's a lot of interesting details in the mix, the commands are still the same. Stand firm, watch, be on your guard, do not be deceived. And so he's still talking somewhat about maintaining your sense of discipleship. Now, it starts out, of course, with the question of the temple. The temple was 1 mile around. It by any standards, it is absolutely the most amazing thing built. It dwarfs the Great Pyramids of Giza. The stones at the base of it are 1 million pounds apiece. It took 46 years to build, and it's just the most impressive thing on the planet. And it's impressive for these disciples, and they're talking to Jesus about it. And he says, they'll all be torn down. And they want to know, tell us, when will this happen? So that gives us a really good context, because Jesus is answering the question about when the temple will be destroyed. And of course, in real time, they're probably about 30 AD. The Bible here, Mark, is probably written in the mid-50s, and the temple will be destroyed in 70 AD. So this is Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple. But he doesn't just deal with the temple. He'll start by telling them to make sure that no one deceives you, that there can be all kinds of rumors. Don't be alarmed. Things will happen, but it'll be rough times, but don't worry. And he's going to get to the one event to look for here in a minute. But his main point is, do not be deceived by someone else claiming to be me, to be on your guard. And then he talks about the cost of the discipleship, that they will be handed over, they'll be flogged, they'll be beaten, and they will have to be witnesses to him, and not to worry about that. And so he speaks about the cost of discipleship as people come against them, and not to be alarmed when natural things happen. There would be the first century, it was a very bloody time. There were a lot of wars, there were a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes, and there were a lot of major catastrophes going on at that time. And he says, don't be deceived by any one of those things. He talks about the cost of discipleship as family turns upon family, but you must stand firm. And then it switches in verse 14. He says, but when you see the abomination that causes desolation, and let the reader understand, even there's a little parenthetical reference there, then flee to the mountains. If you're on the roof, don't go back down. If you're in the field, don't come back home. Hope it's not during the winter, or you have anyone who's pregnant or nursing. That's going to be really difficult for you. It's a real change. So far he's been saying you need to stand firm, stick to your ground. There's going to be all kinds of things going on, and you just stand firm. And now all of a sudden he's saying you need to run. And the change comes with this abomination that causes desolation. This is a quote from Daniel, so this is a phrase that they were used to. And they would have said, well, this was back 150 years ago when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar during the Maccabean revolts, and some of that happens between the Old Testament and New Testament. That's what they were probably thinking of. But this abomination that causes desolation was kind of this apocalyptic phrase that was something that would come that would be so over-the-top sacrilege. And when you see that, that's when you need to flee. And about 67, there are different theories for this, so I'll tell you what I believe is perhaps the best teaching here that I've come across, is that about 67 AD, there's a man named John of Gilshala. And he is a zealot who is living in Jerusalem, and he sets himself up as a false priest and a very bloody, bloodthirsty, power-hungry person in Jerusalem. And he kind of attacks, and there's all these civil war in Jerusalem, and Rome comes to try to get control, and they're at a standstill. and the fall of Jerusalem is well documented. You can go on, there's all kinds of books and articles and YouTube videos that will talk about the fall of Jerusalem and what happens. But at that point, Jesus has been teaching against the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. But the priesthood, they were still giving sacrifices and Day of Atonement and all these things. They were still doing burnt offerings, still doing sacrifices. When this John comes and ruins this system, it is the religious abomination. And it's right about this time when Rome will come and completely destroy Jerusalem, leveling it. And many of the Christians do escape. I mean, they see what's going on, and most of the believers who are living in Jerusalem, they flee to the area of the Decapolis. And it's been estimated up to maybe 1 million Jews die in Jerusalem in 70 AD as the temple is completely destroyed. Not one stone standing on another. There was so much gold in the temple and it melts at a low temperature, and so the gold melts and seeps between the cracks of all the temple, so that Romans come in and they literally pry every stone apart from each other. They take the gold back, and it's with that money that they actually build the Roman Colosseum that still stands today. So it would be completely flattened, and that was beyond anyone's idea. And so this follows in line with not only the cost of discipleship, but in the last chapter, all of the judgment that he was just speaking against it, the tree that had been withered, that which was supposed to stand out and thrive at the roots, it would be destroyed. And so that's really what happened. So these are things that were just years away that have happened in the past. It's not the end of the world here. This is the falling of Jerusalem. If it's the end of the world, it doesn't matter where you're running from or coming down to get your coat. That would be the end. But they are fleeing here from the destruction of the city that would happen 15 years after the gospel's written. And so next time we'll come together and look at the rest of this prophetic chapter in chapter 13 for our next 12-minute mark. God bless.